Welcome to week 3 here at George Washington University's PSHS 6240 Political Violence and Terrorism. Just want to start off by wishing everyone a happy Mother's Day. So to the moms out there who are in the class, or to those who have moms and wives and even daughters that are mothers, just wanted to extend a happy Mother's Day to all of you. Start off just with announcements. Just the Adobe Connect session is this Thursday, May 18th, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will give you a link this week, so you can just, all you have to do is click on the link and you're entered into the Adobe Connect session. If you're doing it from your iPhone or your iPad, they might make you install a little Adobe plugin, but no, we'll get that knocked out. It's optional, again, for everyone. But for those of you who are briefing, it's required. So I look forward to Group 1's presentation. Paper due next Sunday, and I have grading written there. The reason I put grading is that the papers are graded a lot heavier than the discussion sections. Discussion sections I will tend to give full credit, even if not everything is there. The papers, you'll get evaluated with a lot more rigor. So I want to make sure that's clear at the onset. Current events. So the Comey firing, I don't know what to say about that. I don't know if anybody here works at the FBI in this course. I usually have one or two people who are coming from the bureau. That obviously dominated the headlines. What didn't dominate the headlines and what should have was, I know a lot of people are on a cyber track here, and the French election. There was a good article in the New York Times on how the French spoofed the Russians, how the French, or at least the Macron who won, how he beat the Russians, how his cyber team set up all sorts of fake domains, fake websites, and made sure that the Russians could not hack into their campaign. It was an interesting article. And then the massive cyber breaches or cyber attacks or criminal cyber ransom would probably be a better way of putting it, that we've had this past Friday and Saturday, particularly impacting the British NHS, the National Health Service. And again, at the very least, it should tell you how important cyber will be coming, cybersecurity, and I would read into the NHS case studies, and probably more articles will come out in the next couple of days on how the British, their National Health Service, fell asleep at the job and how it became so vulnerable to cyber exploitation. And then finally, briefings. This for the briefing on Thursday. You guys got a example of what I was looking for via Udemy. If there's any questions or issues on that, please let me know. I think I covered it. I covered what I'm looking for as far as format and everything in that brief. So I'd also ask that you get the slides to me Wednesday night, Thursday morning at the latest, so I can put them in the Adobe Connect session. Okay, so review of last week. I emailed an example paper along with this on this announcement, so go ahead and pause me and take a look at that example on YouTube. Okay, so welcome back. What I want to really emphasize on your paper, again, is choose your argument points. Center your paper around your argument points, just like you did in the discussion section when you said, this is why Fort Hood is terrorism, or this is why Columbine is not terrorism. You chose specific facets of your argument to go into detail. And some of the ones that when we discussed this past week are as follows. Military versus non-military. I think I tried to prompt this discussion a little bit. Should terrorists attack be, if it's against a non-military target, it is definitely a terrorist attack. If it's against a military target, it's hard to call something terrorism, because in the military you sign up, you're I would argue a combatant no matter wherever you go, and I'll talk about that in a second. So are attacks against military should they be considered terrorism? Combatant versus non-combatant. We had some good discussion on this. So if you are working at the Pentagon and you are a civilian, are you a combatant? I would argue yes. The USS Cole, you say it's non-combatant because it's not in a war zone that we say, but it's hard to say if you're sitting in Yemen and a huge U.S. warship rolls up on your dock. It's hard to say that they're not combatants or they're not some sort of, this isn't even a war zone, because that ship is rolling up from a different country, is rolling up on your port. Fort Hood, if you believe that Nidal Hassan was a soldier of Allah, as he has stated, isn't Fort Hood, soldiers deploying to Fort Hood, aren't they in a combatant state? Isn't that, if we bomb a barracks or we target somebody in their home, a terrorist, he's a combatant. He's not in the act of committing a terrorist act, but he's certainly a combatant. And if you think that the Iraq war is oppressive, shouldn't soldiers on their way or in processing to be going to Iraq be considered, I don't want to say legitimate, but combatants? We define the combat zone. We say Iraq and Afghanistan is a combat zone. If you are placing an IED on a road in Iraq and you're an insurgent, the combat zone for you is that road. When you go home, you're out of the combat zone. At least that would be his perception. So what you define as a combat zone or within a combat zone is certainly subject to interpretation. So that's something you could bring up. Again, when we talk about Fort Hood, when we talk about the IED convoy in Iraq, those are issues that can come about. State versus non-state. Again, a lot of you said, oh, well, the bombings of Hiroshima and Dresden, because those are state actors, it can't be terrorism. Well, are we just associating the tactic? Airplanes we associate with terrorism, but if, let's say, the United States, all they had to do was use a truck bomb, or that's all they were capable of using was a massive truck bomb in Dresden, would it be considered terrorism? Would it not be considered terrorism? Let me give you another example. Let's say instead of the Dresden, a lot of you said, well, there was military utility in Dresden, there was military utility in Hiroshima, there was a war going on. What happens if I was instead of an aerial target, it was a ground target, and instead of, let's say I received fire from a city in Germany, and then I lined up everyone in the village and shot them? What's the difference between that, which most people would say is a war crime, and bombing from afar, as we did in Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki? And again, I'm not trying to sound anti-American or something like that. I'm just trying to bring up certain points that might influence your argument, whether you think something is state-based violence, war crime, or terrorism. And then the other argument there is, again, states do commit what we call terrorism. If you're Iran and you don't have an air force, your only vector of attack are truck bombs and what we would consider terrorism. Does that make it terrorism because of the tactic, or does it make it terrorism because we say Iran's a state sponsor of terrorism? I don't know. I'll let you decide, and you can flesh that argument out in a little bit of detail. Targeting within or outside the locus of conflict. Certainly, the Algerians, if they had started to bomb Paris, would have painted themselves as more a terrorist group. I'm talking about the FLN, as you saw in the video before. They did commit violent activity, but they were violent activity against civilians, but it was all in the locus of conflict. That arguably makes it less of a terrorist organization than ISIS, which certainly bombs things outside their Syrian, Iraq locus of conflict. Attacking the apparatus of government. Again, Irgun focused against the apparatus of government, or apparatus of oppression. Nelson Mandela focused on the apparatus of oppression, the government entities in South Africa. That's why they're probably more likely to be considered terrorism than focusing against purely civilians. War zone versus non-war zone. I think we talked about this in the combatant versus non-combatant argument, so I'm not going to belabor it too much, but just want to say what you define as a war zone might not be what somebody else defines as a war zone. Political narrative. This is what might separate Columbine from the Fort Hood shooting. But you can argue that everyone has a political narrative in some form or another. The guy, the Newtown, he certainly had a very distorted political narrative. The guy in Orlando, he had a political narrative, or maybe he didn't have a political narrative. It appears he might have had a political narrative, but it also could be psychological, sexual identity issues. So again, going in detail, what is a political narrative separates that from what is just random violence or mental illness. Levels of oppression. Again, we talked about this in the briefing. If you are on the scale of, let me backtrack. Nelson Mandela, the world thinks it's okay what he did, and he engaged and planned violence. But we think it's okay because the apartheid regime was so bad that violence was justified. If you're committing violence to end the Holocaust, if you're Jewish and in Germany in 1945 and you're 44 and you're trying to stop the Holocaust, certainly a level of violence, even against civilians, is acceptable. Or is it? I will let you decide. But there's certain things, if you are oppressed, you get to do that most people would not consider terrorism. Some people will say the Palestinians now. I don't think this, but the Palestinians get to commit their violence, or their violence is justifiable because they're oppressed in some way. The ISIS, arguably, ISIS, because of the oppression of Sunnis on both the Syrian and Iraq side, they get to commit violence because of that level of oppression. So on the case studies that I brought up, think about levels of oppression and does that justify violence? And the FLN and Irgun are, again, examples that you'll have to justify. Politically popular versus non-popular, this is something that what separates an insurgency from a terrorism. I think some people brought this up, that the FLN might be acceptable because they were a little bit more popular, politically popular, than just say a random violent terrorist group. The Irgun had a level of popular support, so they're an insurgency vice a terrorist organization. A lot of people made that argument in Afghanistan with the Taliban versus Al-Qaeda. The Taliban have a political base and therefore should not be considered a terrorist group. Al-Qaeda is an outside entity with no popular support. Therefore, they should have more of a, or they should be considered a terrorist group. Degree of association. Again, the Fort Hood shooting. We know that Nidal Hasan was associated with Anwar al-Awlaki. They were emailing back and forth. And therefore, Nidal Hasan should be considered a terrorist because of that association. However, Anwar, there was no planning in those emails. There was no nothing that would overtly say that Anwar al-Awlaki and Nidal Hasan are conspiring. So are they associated? The Orlando shooter, he pledged ISIS. He pledged allegiance to ISIS after the fact. Does that make him associated with terrorism or associated with ISIS and therefore a terrorist? You'll have to define that if you choose to go there, what an association is, what isn't. So these are facets, and you could come up with your own, but these are some of the ones that we discussed this past week of to pin your argument around on your paper. And then just a paper with the format looking for intro, argument points, rebuttal, policy recommendations, if you have any. And again, please don't give me history. Do not give me history. Do not give me history. Get to the point of those case studies. So illustrative example, again, if you're making the point about the Irgun, it's a highly oppressed group that focuses on the apparatus of oppression within the locus of conflict. So the Irgun, in the backdrop of the Holocaust, if you're going to say the Irgun's not terrorism, they're highly oppressed because of the backdrop of the Holocaust. They focus on the apparatus of the oppression, and it's within the locus of conflict. So you could certainly make a paper that says the Irgun's not terrorism based on these factors. FLN, I'm not going to go into those, but these are just some of the examples, the facets. Highly oppressed, arguably, focus on civilians within locus of conflict. So you can make an argument that on the spectrum, FLN would be closer to a terrorist organization. And then Al-Qaeda, not really oppressed, focus on civilians outside the locus of conflict. So that would make it more on the spectrum of a terrorist organization. So this is what I want you to argue in your paper. If you have any questions or issues, please let me know. And I think I've given you enough examples and leeway to go into detail here. So week 3 preview. Terrorism History Part 2. Road to 9/11. Excellent documentary, and it's out there on YouTube. The Zakaria article, the Why Do They Hate Us? That's the seminal post 9/11 article that says not only why the terrorism occurred, but why did it appear, for those of you who are old enough, that so many people were celebrating the 9/11 attacks. And that was horrifying to many people here in the States. Social, political, demographic, historical, cultural factors. Those try to explain the road to 9/11. Those factors, and I talk about it in my lecture. And then terrorism finance is the second part of week 3. Really focus on the ISIS finance. That's the more important takeaway of it. And I have a couple of articles on that in your folder. So again, if there's questions or issues, please let me know. Good luck on the paper, and I'll see you on the discussion board.